Greetings, everyone. So session 3 tonight. We're going to be covering 1840 to just a little bit after the Civil War. We'll look at the new two-party system. We'll look at the sectional divide that's started to peak during the Jacksonian period, now getting far worse. Nativism, something that some people want to deny exists or existed still, but it did and still does. This infamous Sumner Brooks affair and kind of congressional violence at its best, and Civil War politics. So I gave you a short piece out of a book that I've been promoting on politics and how it's evolved, and that book had a lot of impact on how I approached this course. And just to read a paragraph from it: wild rallies, bustling saloons, street corner debates, the sarcastic press, and a love of costumes, fireworks, barbecue, and lager beer all helped heat campaigns into vibrant spectacles. Participation was highest among the working class and poorer citizens, and often incorporated recent immigrants, young voters, and newly enfranchised African Americans. In an age of disruption and isolation, many found identity, friendship, and meaning in that participation. So Charles Dickens. He arrived in 1842 in the spring and received a hero's welcome. He was wildly popular in the United States and widely read. Unfortunately for him, most of what people in America were reading were pirated copies, and he made nothing from them. But he nonetheless came, and to quote him, "The crowds pour in and out the whole day, the people that line the streets of the cheering when I went out to the theater." And you can see on this map, he arrives in Boston, and he goes through New York and Philly, and he heads south. He gets down as far as Richmond. And in Richmond, he's so turned off by the slavery that he sees in the slave markets and the auctions, which he did eyewitness. He cancels the rest of his southern trip and heads back north, back to central PA and out west to St. Louis and back. And he quickly changes his tune, although he had been excited about his visit to America. This is not the Republic of my imagination. He wrote that in a letter to his closest friend, who was his first biographer following his death. And when Dickens returned home to England, he published a work called The American Notes for General Circulation. He rips the United States for what he sees, and it's quite telling. Of course, it's not well received in the United States. He loses a lot of fans, but they still read his novels. Anyway, in American Notes, he wrote, "Look at the exhausted treasury, the paralyzed government, the unworthy representatives of a free people, the desperate contest between the North and the South, the iron curb and brazen muzzle fastened upon every man who speaks his mind, even in that Republican hall to which Republican men are sent by a Republican people to speak Republican truths, the stabbings and shootings and coarse and brutal threatenings exchanged between senators under the very Senate's roof, the intrusion of the most pitiful, mean, malicious, creeping, crawling, sneaking party spirit into all transactions of life." And he wrote that in 1842-43. And of course, things are going to get far worse than what he experienced when he was there. More on Dickens later. So the evolution of the two-party system, which we talked first about last week, which begins approximately with the election of 1828 and the arrival of Andrew Jackson as our president. American democracy got a lot noisier. Torchlight parades, stump speeches, and country barbecues. The top painting, again from George Caleb Bingham, who I showed you a different painting last week, chronicling these early 19th century voter turnouts. And this is very likely a pretty accurate portrayal of what voting day looked like in middle America at that time. Below it are the wide awakes, an important representation of the public displays of political talk and campaigning that would take place and so illustrate the politics of pre and immediately post-Civil War. Jacksonian Democrats clung to executive authority, maintained their anti-elite posture, and promoted the spoil system. Remember, the spoil system is giving political jobs to your friends for their loyalty and hard work to help get you elected. And this becomes, the spoil system becomes the lifeblood of the party system as it existed at that time. The short-lived Whig Party promoted congressional authority in direct conflict with Jackson. There was already this clash between the legislative and the executive branches. Remember, the framers of the Constitution had expected Congress to lead and not the president, but that has evolved differently. And certainly by the time of Jackson, the president is kind of doing a side run, undermining some of the congressional authority. And of course, we're still saddled with that conflict today. It has ebbed and flowed between 1828 and 2021. The Whigs also promoted internal improvements. They were the party that said, let's take federal money and promote transportation, which at that time meant canals, railroads were just starting to evolve, and the telegraph being, of course, our first internet. And the tariff, they were protecting business. They thought business was how the United States would keep its economy healthy and give people jobs and make the economy grow. Whereas the Democrats at this time under Jackson are taking the anti-elite position, which means they don't support business leaders, whereas the Whigs do. Of course, the issue of slavery would bring the second two-party system crashing down by the election of 1860. The Know Nothing Party. It started as a secret party. In fact, as a nativist, as one who was prejudiced to a lot of different types of people. They didn't want to admit it in public, so they would walk around secretly. And if you were approached with a specific question that they didn't feel comfortable with, they would just say, I know nothing. That gets out to the public, and eventually they're christened the Know Nothing Party, and they ultimately accept that name. You can see the poster on the right, left. Natives of the soil arouse. They were anti-Catholic, they were anti-Irish, they were anti-immigrant, very xenophobic, and they saw these new people coming into the American population as threatening the very existence of America as they knew it, and they wanted to see if they could stop that. They were populists, so they embraced the same kind of campaign styles and themes as Jackson. Therefore, they too were anti-elites. They were pro-working class, and surprisingly, I think to me, they included women here, arguing for women's work, women's right to work. They weren't arguing for the right to vote, though. And they promoted the Romanist conspiracy that was allegedly being planned to subvert civil and religious liberty in the United States. and sought to politically organize native-born Protestants into what they described as a defense of their traditional religious and political values. That theme should sound familiar. An important figure for the Southern position throughout this time, beginning with his work under Andrew Jackson and then as Senator from South Carolina, was John C. Calhoun. And as early as 1837, he wrote an editorial essay pamphlet, Slavery, a Positive Good. And here are a couple excerpts. I do not belong to the school which holds that aggression is to be met by concession. Mine is the opposite creed, which teaches that encroachments must be met at the beginning and that those who act on the opposite principle are prepared to become slaves. We must meet the enemy on the frontier. I appeal to facts. Never before has the Black race of Central Africa, from the dawn of history to the present day, attained a condition so civilized and so improved, not only physically, but morally and intellectually. And finally, the relation now existing in the slaveholding states between the two races is, instead of an evil, a good, a positive good. And he's going to represent the defensive posture that the South will take in arguing to maintain the peculiar institution as it became known as. So a second conspiracy that emerges, the first being the Romanists with the Know Nothings, became known as the slave power conspiracy. Here's a cartoon from Currier and Ives from the period, and this was around the same time as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, in which they allowed slavery to exist in Kansas after a bloody, bloody fight. And there was a faction pretty much on the Whig side of things. So they were not pro-South, and they were called Free Soilers, but that's a misleading name for people today, because Free Soilers says, oh, they're abolitionists. They were not abolitionists. These were white men who argued that the new territories should be kept free, not because they opposed slavery. They didn't support it, but they didn't oppose it. But so that white men would be able to get the territory as they become states. So this is forcing slavery down the throat of a free soiler. And you notice the gentleman on the right pulling the hair are standing on the planks of Central America, Cuba, and Kansas as part of the Democratic platform. Stay tuned for more on that. The conspiracy promoted the idea that a small group of rich slave owners had seized political control of their own states and were trying to take over the federal government in an illegitimate fashion in order to expand and protect slavery. And there are many, many pieces in the New York Times, the Herald, Harper's Weekly, and other northern papers talking about the slave power conspiracy. So it gets a lot of coverage and becomes very believable for many readers. And this all dates back to the 3/5 compromise. Remember, the 3/5 compromise, which we talked about in the first session, was the deal that the northern states had to cut with the southern states if they were going to get the South to support the Constitution. So they would not, where they were not willing to give slaves equal representation, again, just for counting heads, they weren't ever going to be able to vote. And the formula they came up with was 100 slaves equals 60 people. And this was for the proportionment of seats in the House of Representatives as well as electoral college votes. So the South has an unfair advantage. Supported by abolitionists, free soilers, and white working class. The slave power conspiracy. The Knights of the Golden Circle, the KGC. There's their secret symbol, and it was secret. And here was their plan, which I will outline for you. In 1854, secret plans were laid to acquire Cuba, Mexico, Central America, Dominican Republic, and Haiti for the purpose of combining them with the southern states. The purpose was to form a new country that would preserve slavery. So as early as 1854, they're already talking about secession in secrecy, making a plan to strengthen themselves by adding more territory so that they could have their own southern nation, 1854, not 1860. It was a plan like this that gave credence to the slave power conspiracy, because it was secret, yet it wasn't, because it gets out. So I mentioned Bleeding Kansas before. This was the first major fight over the expansion of slavery and whether or not you could allow slavery to expand past the Mississippi River. In attacking the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1856, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, a senator, wrote or spoke, "It is the rape of a virgin territory, compelling it to the hateful embrace of slavery, and it may be clearly traced to a depraved desire for a new slave state, hideous offspring of such a crime, in the hope of adding to the power of slavery in the national government." And he gives this speech on the floor of the Senate. Representative Brooks, who knew this speech was going to be given, from South Carolina, again, see a theme running through South Carolina, comes over to the floor of the Senate from his House chambers and attacks Sumner. And this is arguably one of the most famous pre-Civil War political cartoons. It appears everywhere and is illustrative of how civility is breaking down in our own halls of Congress. There's the actual cane that he used to beat Senator Sumner, who suffered a traumatic brain injury and couldn't return to the Senate for 3 years. The Richmond Enquirer editorialized that Sumner should be caned, quote, every morning, praising the attack as good in conception, better in execution, and best of all in consequences. The episode revealed the polarization in America, which had now reached the floor of the Senate. Brooks's action was symbolic of the breakdown of reasoned discourse. I want to read a little bit here. So Sumner on the floor is giving his speech. You saw the one quote, and he says, "A mistress who, though ugly to others, is always lovely to him, though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean, the harlot slavery," end quote. According to one modern historian of this event, quote, "It is also important to note the sexual imagery that recurred throughout the oration, which was neither accidental nor without precedent. Abolitionists routinely accused slaveholders of maintaining slavery so that they could engage in forcible sexual relations with their slaves," end quote. Sumner's own adopted daughter, Mary Mildred Williams, was a white-appearing girl born into slavery who was the descendant of such a relationship before being freed with the help of Sumner. Brooks was infuriated and intended to challenge Sumner to a duel. After having consulted with fellow South Carolinian Congressman Lawrence Kite on the situation, Brooks and Kite decided that Sumner had the social status of a drunkard and was thus unworthy of the traditional challenge to a duel. In other words, Brooks's reputation was so bad that he didn't have the social standing to actually attempt a duel. Brooks, accompanied by Kite, approached and confronted Sumner as he sat writing at his desk in the almost empty Senate chamber. As Sumner began to stand up, Brooks began beating Sumner severely on the head with a thick gutta-percha cane with a gold head before he could reach his feet. Sumner was knocked down and trapped under the heavy desk, which was bolted to the floor, but Brooks continued to bash Sumner until he ripped the desk from the floor. By this time, Sumner was blinded by his own blood and he staggered up the aisle and collapsed, lapsing into unconsciousness. Brooks continued to beat the motionless Sumner until he broke his cane and quietly left the chamber. Several other senators attempted to help Sumner, but were blocked by Kite, who had jumped into the aisle brandishing a pistol and shouting, "Let them be." Kite was censured for his actions and resigned in protest, but was overwhelmingly reelected to his seat by his South Carolina constituency within the month. For several decades following, senators often carried walking canes and even revolvers into the Senate chamber, fearing a similar assault. Here's a couple more newspaper excerpts from the Richmond Whig. A glorious deed, a most glorious deed. Mr. Brooks of South Carolina administered to Senator Sumner, a notorious abolitionist from Massachusetts, an effectual and classic caning. We are rejoiced. The only regret we feel is that Mr. Brooks did not employ a slave whip instead of a stick. From the Petersburg Intelligencer, we entirely concur with the Richmond Whig that if thrashing is the only remedy by which the abolitionists can be controlled, that it will be well to give Senator Seward a double dose at least every day until it operates freely on his political bowels. You get the idea how popular Brooks was in the South. 2 years later, Congressman Kite, who had joined Brooks, was involved in another incident of legislative violence, starting a massive brawl on the House floor during a tense late-night debate. Kite became offended when Pennsylvania Congressman, who later became Speaker of the House, Galusha Grau, stepped over to the Democratic side of the House chamber while delivering an anti-slavery speech. Kite dismissively interrupted Grau's speech to demand he sit down, calling him, quote, a black Republican puppy. Grau indignantly responded by telling Kite that, quote, no Negro driver shall crack his whip over me, end quote. Kite became enraged and went for Grau's throat, shouting that he would choke him for that. A large brawl, involved approximately 50 representatives on the floor of the House, ending only when a missed punch from Representative Cadwallader Washburn of Wisconsin upended the hairpiece of Representative William Barksdale of Mississippi. The embarrassed Barksdale accidentally replaced the wig backwards, causing both sides to erupt in spontaneous laughter. Kite would later die of wounds following his battle, the Battle of Cold Harbor, while he fought for the Confederacy. And Barksdale, of course, was a famous general for the South as well at the Battle of Gettysburg. So that all leads into the election of 1856. And in 1856, you have James Buchanan representing the Democrats, Pennsylvania's one claim to fame, if you want to call it that, who wins. He beats the Republican, John C. Fremont. This is the first time the Republicans were a serious party at the presidential level. And why I even included this was the third party, Millard Fillmore. Fillmore ran, former president, as the presidential nominee for the Know Nothing Party. He got 8 electoral votes and he got over 800,000, 8 electoral college votes, and he got over 800,000 in the popular vote. Clearly the issue was pro-slavery versus the extension of slavery. Not pro-slavery versus abolition, just whether or not the slavery could be extended into, the new territories. Buchanan essentially did nothing as president of the United States and just watched as things got worse. He took no action on either side. So the Great Unraveling, political violence dramatically increases in the 50s. Here's a painting of the 5 Points in New York City, site of many brawls, many of them just gang related. 1851, the Christiana riot in Lancaster County. Whites were protesting against free blacks and their rights, because this was outside of Philadelphia, which was the safe harbor, still under the influence of Quakers. And it got violent. Most of these riots are all race related. Cincinnati, hotbed of secessionists and pro-slavery people in Ohio, was the site of many different riots. The Lager Beer Riot, love the name, has nothing to do with slavery. In this case, it was anti-immigrant. This was in Chicago, and of course, there's a large body of Poles coming in and other groups from Central Europe now, starting in Central Europe, and Germans. And so whites were protesting, worried about the power of the immigrant vote in Chicago. Irish too, by the way. The Portland Rum Riot, Portland, Maine. I put this in just because it was unique. They were protesting the prohibition law. This was one of the first places where they really attempted to prohibit liquor consumption in the United States, and it was hotly contended. Know Nothing Riot, Louisville. The Detroit Brothel Riots. This was a protest by white men who were upset that blacks were allowed into the brothels to consort with the ladies, and that the white guys thought that black men should not be allowed in the brothels. So race related, but kind of unique. Bleeding Kansas, again, this becomes kind of the first civil war before the Civil War. Kansas is going to struggle between the secessionists, pro-black, pro-slavery, and the abolitionists from 1856 with its entrance into the United States all the way through the Civil War. So while the Civil War was being fought, Kansas had its own little Civil War. It was a nasty, nasty example of vigilantism and partisan fighting, many deaths. Battle of Seattle. This was Indian tribes had emerged as a key element in Seattle, Washington. And so there was a fight between the Indian tribes of Seattle and whites over whether or not Indians should have any rights. Essentially, they didn't have any. They had less rights than black men at this point. The Potawatomi Massacre in Kansas, one of the most infamous elements of the whole Bleeding Kansas situation. And this is where John Brown emerges as an important player in the politics of abolitionism, where he will hack to death with a broadsword some pro-slave guys. Becomes a hero for some. Another Know Nothing riot, this time in Baltimore. The San Francisco Vigilance Movement. This was all about the population, the immigrant population, which of course was heavily Chinese at this time in San Francisco, and concerned that the immigrants were going to have rights equal to whites. Another Know Nothing riot, this time in DC. The New York City Police Riot. This was a riot between police factions. They were trying to modernize the New York City police, and the old school police would have nothing to do with it. And so they had a riot on the streets between themselves. Had nothing to do with slavery or immigration or anything. And but as a result of that, in the same year, you have the Dead Rabbits riot. Dead Rabbits was one of the more infamous gangs, and it's a gang war. And they took advantage of the fact that the police were discombobulated, and that very well may be what's being portrayed in the painting to the right. Another Know Nothing riot. You see the theme running through all this with the Know Nothings. This time in New Orleans. And finally, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, 1859. And now a little bit more about John Brown. John Brown. Slavery throughout its entire existence in the United States is none other than the most barbarous, unprovoked, and unjustifiable war of one portion of its citizens against another portion, the only conditions of which are perpetual imprisonment and hopeless servitude, or absolute extermination, in utter disregard and violation of those eternal and self-evident truths set forth in our Declaration of Independence. Oops, sorry. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land can never be purged away but with blood. So these were statements made after Potawatomi and in preparation for his raid on Harper's Ferry, where he wanted to take over a munitions armory and hopefully inspire a slave revolt, which would spread throughout the South. Of course, it doesn't end that way. He's captured and he's going to be hung as a traitor. I included this because it has a local flavor for Philadelphia. It's entitled The Last Moments of John Brown. And this was a painting. If you've driven down through, I've moved away 4 years ago, so I forget the name of the road. It's in Plymouth Meeting, and it's near the old lime kiln. It's Lime Kiln Pike. It's near the old lime kilns that are still there, kind of just to show you where they were. And there's a place called, and there's a blue historic sign. It's on the left if you're heading towards down Lime Kiln Pike, and it's called Abolition Hall. It's a stone barn. The artist was working there. There were some abolitionist meetings held there too, and he paints this piece of John Brown. This is a romantic portrayal of him as he's getting ready to be hung. If it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done. The first battles of the Civil War were waged in Congress itself.
Yep.
The third two-party system was birthed amidst polarization and violence. The Republicans represented most of the North and Midwest. Abolitionists, Unionists, and those who supported internal improvements and modernization. We spoke to this, the Whigs had first supported this all day. By now, we're talking railroads by the time of the Civil War instead of canals. The Democrats represented the South and traditional Northern Democrats who were nicknamed Copperheads. That's the cartoon in the distance there, portraying a copperhead, a traitor in the minds of the North. Pro-slavers and racists, redeemers, as they were called, including former Southern white Republicans who didn't accept the idea of the end of slavery. Catholic immigrants as well, because the Catholic immigrants who were situated more in Boston and New York at this time, not so much, somewhat in Philly too, saw the freedmen as a conflict for them as far as getting jobs. They didn't want the freedmen taking their jobs. So in the consequential election of 1860, you have two Democrats this time. Obviously, you have Lincoln, who's going to win. The Democrats split. It's quite clear that Stephen Douglas of Illinois is going to get the Democratic nomination because he's promoting an idea of popular sovereignty. Let each state decide for themselves whether or not they would be free or slave. The South walks in that convention, and they nominate Breckinridge, hardcore pro-slave. So with the Democrats dividing the vote, there's no way that they could defeat Lincoln, as you can see from the Electoral College vote. Remember, the popular vote really has no meaning. There was a third-party candidate representing the Constitutional Union Party, Bell. He said, he's from Kentucky, let's let things stay as they are. We'll figure out our problems. Let's not draw swords and shoot at each other. We can compromise. And of course, he didn't get much support. And Lincoln says, elections belong to the people. It's their decision. If they decide to turn their back on the fire and burn their behinds, then they will just have to sit on their blisters. Kind of a poignant comment. So the draft and emancipation. This is a cartoon drawn at the outset of the Civil War, and you see the monster of rebellion being held on a chain by Jeff Davis. And you have two generals who are pounding away with their skills and strategy. But you have Stanton and Lincoln holding their own mallets labeled Draft and Emancipation Proclamation. And the point here being that what's really going to defeat the South is having a larger army through the draft and then freeing the slaves. Of course, political and racial violence continues during the war itself. I know that doesn't surprise anyone. The Baltimore riot of 1861, where you have Union militia are trying to join up with the Union Army, and they are halted temporarily by Confederate sympathizers. It gets bloody. You have the Camp Jackson affair, where Union forces clash with the Confederate sympathizers. You have the Buffalo riot of 62, which was, in this case, a riot against free blacks. You have the Detroit race riot in 63. You have, even in the South, problems, the Southern bread riots. By 63, there was a lot of hunger in the South because the war was so expensive to the South, who had much more limited capacity for sustenance of their home front. You have the Battle of Fort Fizzle, which was in Ohio, a resistance to the draft, kind of a forerunner to the big one, which was New York City draft riots, which is actually portrayed in the print in the background. And you have a Charleston riot. So the New York City draft riots is a pretty infamous event. And white working class men who could not pay the $300 commutation fee nor find a substitute did not see this as their work to fight by 1863. If you had $300, which was a lot of money in those days, or you could find somebody to substitute for you, which meant you were going to pay them or give them something, you had to be drafted into the army. And by 63, the North isn't doing all that well, and the casualty reports are appalling. And so this sparks what becomes known as the New York City Draft Riot. What began as a political protest quickly turned into a violent race riot against Black Americans. The fiercest fighting occurred between Irish longshoremen and free blacks along the docks. Approximately 120 people were killed, including 6 black men lynched. And interesting point to note, because we're going to be talking about machine politics next week. The Tweed, Boss Tweed, Democratic political machine that pretty much ran New York City, watched from the sidelines, didn't take sides, didn't see that they could win anything out of this, and so just let it go. Machine politics are becoming more and more important, and immediately after the Civil War become crucial to most major cities in the United States. And I want to read something else to you here. One topic that did polarize the Confederate public was the conscription, fancy name for draft. In the early months of the war, Southern white men volunteered in droves, expecting to whip a dozen Yankees each. But by April 1862, the realities of a long, expansive conflict, an unprecedented mortality rate hurt recruitment, and the Confederate Congress turned to coercion. It was enormously unpopular from the start, not only because young white men were less eager to leave their families and die in battle, but also because a major motive of the rebellion had been fear of centralized authority. Under the United States government, Americans had had very little, if any, experience with federal power. Making war and delivering the mail was about it. Secession and the start of Civil War had been based on a theoretical and future growth of central power. Confederate draft was the first in American history, and it became quite a shock. Forcing its citizens to fight and die, Southerners understood, is the ultimate exercise of government authority. The Confederate government, observes historian Paul Quigley, implemented an extraordinary expansion of central authority, intervening in the national economy, creating a massive military and civilian bureaucracy, and controlling the day-to-day economic activities, even the lives and deaths of its citizens. Sensing their constituents' displeasure with the horror of conscription and the frightening expansion of centralized power, many candidates running for seats in the Second Confederate Congress condemned the policy. They'll eventually back off, but kind of the damage was done, and it also illustrates the internal conflict that the South had. It wasn't all, guts and glory, beat the Yankees. Another issue they had was taxation. Taxation became another divisive issue that undermined government authority and elicited vigorous protests from whites. Having no money at the start of the war, the government printed huge amounts of Confederate currency that was worthless in most places. By 1863, skyrocketing inflation forced Congress to find alternatives to financing the war. So they start taxing, and they're taxing the people who could afford it least. So there's internal political conflict on both sides in the war, plus the violence. The war ends, of course, and Lincoln is assassinated. And so in his place is Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was a Democrat. And in 1864, Lincoln was very concerned that he could not be reelected, and that if he was not reelected, that the Union wouldn't survive, because there was so much political turmoil within the North from the Copperhead Democrats, as well as the fact that although they had won some battles, it wasn't completely rosy for the North. So he picks Andrew Johnson, a Tennessee Democrat, to be his running mate. And Lincoln doesn't even run as a Republican. They call it the Union Party. And the hope is that you're going to get border state voters and some Democrats to vote for Lincoln. As it turns out, he really had nothing to fear. The Union Army came and voted en masse for Lincoln. So he really didn't need to take the approach of Andrew Johnson on the ticket, but he did. And of course, it's kind of a fateful decision. So Lincoln's gone. Johnson, a Southern Democrat, is president, and he is not in favor of a harsh, radical Republican reunification of the United States that would punish the South to a great degree. And he's also not wild about the idea of freedmen having the right to vote. So there's a race riot in New Orleans, first of a couple big ones. And Johnson really doesn't do anything. And in 1866, he's actually running around what's left of the country, mostly in the North, campaigning for the re-election or the election of representatives, because this is a midterm election, who would support him, because he's getting so much grief from the radical Republicans. This is a Thomas Nast cartoon that he actually painted, and then they made a print out of it, and it appears in Harper's Weekly and other places. Following on the heels of the slaughter of freedmen in Memphis, which precedes New Orleans, by white supremacists, the New Orleans massacre occurs. Within 2 hours, 34 freedmen had been killed, and an additional 120 were wounded. Johnson was being blamed by Republicans for his sympathetic approach to reuniting the Union. So there's real pressure growing to dump Johnson. And Johnson himself was a horrible politician, did not give good speeches, contradicted himself. He was pretty abysmal. And so emerges an important player that most people who study Civil War politics have no idea about, and I didn't until I read the new book. William Pig Iron Kelly, Philadelphia man. He's he's quite a guy. He was an ardent abolitionist, one of the founders of the Republican Party. He was a close friend of Abraham Lincoln's, and he was a congressional representative for Pennsylvania, Philly, from 1861 to 1890. That's a long, long time for that time period. He campaigned for the formation of U.S. colored troops, which would be formed and play an important role in the latter half of the war. He was a judge. He started as a Democrat and evolves into the Republican Party once the Democrats take their position on slavery. He adopts the radical Republican platform. So he's becoming what at that time would have been considered an extremist Republican. And he campaigned in the South following the war, arguing for Black suffrage. Kelly placed himself on the radical fringe of the radical Republicans of 1865, a rare supporter of abolition, women's rights, workers' rights, and many other unusual, crankish causes. He had spent the past few years, sharing stages with his friend Frederick Douglass and mentoring Anna Dickinson, an electrifying 20-year-old girl orator. Few white men in America would have done the same. Kelly was totally out of the mainstream. At a time when slavery still remained in limbo, when most white Americans were publicly and unabashedly racist, Kelly attacked, quote, the hypocritical lip service, end quote, with which Americans talked about the notion of equality. Give people rights or they will be justified in taking them. The Republic only makes itself, quote, safer when she binds all her children to her by protecting the rights of all. Kelly's view of democracy, the bigger the better, the louder the safer, captured the populist tone of 19th century politics. So here's a guy who was a populist within the Republican Party and becomes one of the leading radical Republicans, even though he doesn't really front any of the legislation. He's going to be an important mouthpiece for what becomes known as Reconstruction. So the war's over and he heads south, even though he's still representing Philadelphia, campaigning for Black suffrage. And he arrives in Mobile, Alabama. Meanwhile, he has been gaining more and more bad press from the Democrats and the Southerners as he goes through the town speaking in favor of Black suffrage. And what occurs is what the newspapers call the Kelly Riot in March 13th of 1867. So he's down south, as I just said, campaigning for votes. By the time Kelly arrived in Mobile, yes, that's right, I did say Mobile, the Mobile Times, a hostile Democratic newspaper, had whipped up an angry faction to meet Kelly. He spoke in front of 4,000 people that night. Kelly's main points included rights of freedmen, named for now the former slaves, promotion of Reconstruction policies, and hopes for reconciliation with the South. Shots were fired and the platform was swept by bullets, resulting in 2 dead and 20 wounded, though Kelly remained unscathed. He would continue on his travels through the South despite this attack. Never again would he have shots fired at him while he's in the South. Harper's Weekly reported on this event, and they say, radical incendiary? We find the following atrocious sentiments in the speech delivered at Montgomery a day or two after the Mobile riot by that fanatical incendiary and radical disorganizer, Judge Kelly. We quote from the report in the New York Herald, quote, he urged them to build rolling mills, erect furnaces, employ the water power at Wetumpka and up in the other cotton districts, and to rotate their crops as we do in the North. The day will come when Alabama will not confine herself to cotton as her sole crop, but she will send her railroad iron to the Gulf. The wives and daughters of men, as dusky as those around him, would spin the cotton. They need not tell him they can't do it, for he had visited the colored schools and found enough talent and intelligence there to convince him that they had the laborers at hand if they only trained them. Addressing the white people, Mr. Kelly said he failed to find any other reason for the difference between the North and South than their contempt for the rights of man as man. He urged them to set aside their prejudices and reconstruct the South promptly and willingly. So William Kelly is one of those kind of unsung heroes for the North that a lot of people have no idea about. And he's going to raise a daughter who will become almost as famous as her father. And we'll talk about her a little bit next time. She's going to be even more radical than her father. Nobody had better undertake to put me down. I tell you that you cannot put me down. I am not afraid. That's Kelly. So Andrew Johnson is going to be impeached. He's vetoing bills left and right. He's blocking radical reconstruction, and the Republicans have had enough. So he is impeached, but he's not removed. He's being portrayed here as King Andy. Kind of remember the King Andrew Jackson cartoon last week. Sir, the bloody and untilled fields of the 10 unreconstructed states, the unsheeted ghosts of the 2,000 murdered Negroes in Texas cry for the punishment of Andrew Johnson. That's Pig Iron Kelly saying that. And so Dickens, we started with Dickens, we end with Dickens. He came excited about the United States, hearing all these wonderful things, and then was kind of turned off in 1842 at the violence and the slavery that he saw firsthand, published his American Notes. Disgruntled Americans still read his novels. And at the time of the Civil War, he commented, "There is not a pin to choose between the two parties. They will both rant and lie and fight until they come to a compromise. And the slave may be thrown into that compromise or thrown out of it, just as it happens." This then is the fundamental paradox of the era, and perhaps of our own. Americans bemoaned the failure of their democracy, but also joined in its worst habits with a zealous fixation. An already overworked citizenry devoted incredible amounts of unpaid labor to politics. Why bother? Why turn out? In particular, why participate in a government that so many agreed was broken, rigged, and rotten? But they did turn out, and in large numbers. In the next class, we shall see why those numbers began to dwindle and why voter turnout dropped dramatically. So we'll be looking at Reconstruction, or the attempt at Reconstruction, the Grant presidency, to me, one of the unsung heroes of American political history, the election of 1876, domestic terrorism, the decline of voter participation, and will end during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, approximately in 1915. And I see that it is 6 o'clock, so I'm on time, and we will open this up to questions. Definitely silence. Remember, I can't yell at, well, I could yell at you. I'm not going to. I won't give you any negative table slaps, which I often did. Edward would attest to that, I'm sure. Hopefully I never gave him a negative table slap. But anybody have any questions? If not, I did a wonderful job, and we'll say goodnight early.
Hey, Kendall, I'm here.
Hi, Peter.
Hi. So, as you know, I've been reading a lot of a lot about Native Americans, and you had made a reference to them. To what extent did the Native American issues, which included obviously the raping of the land and so forth, affect the politics that emerged during the Civil War?
Are you asking how if it did?
Yeah, if it did.
American, it doesn't. This is all about the land grab. One of the most important economic bills that the Republicans passed during the Civil War, because there are virtually very few Democrats to stop them. They're going to pass the Homestead Act, which will enable the land grabs, the cheap land, to be made available right after the war, and you see made famous in all the westerns, the Oklahoma Sooners and all that. And of course, that's at the expense of the Indians. Sherman, who was famous for his march to the sea in Georgia, is shortly, with the war over, is going to head west and start fighting the American Indian, as well as others. So the Indian Wars, there were some small fights during the Civil War, not much, but they're going to pick up right away in 1866, and of course run unabated until Wounded Knee in 1892, I think. Yeah. So there were a few people, Nast included, the cartoonist, who will argue for the rights of Native Americans, but it was a very unpopular position to take.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
I have a
Mr.
question.
Krickenberger? Go ahead, Matt.
Oh, sorry if someone else said something.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
I had a question about something from really early on. You mentioned the spoil system under Jackson, and that went on for a couple of decades, or a few more than that.
Still goes on today, actually.
Yeah, well, that's actually my question. So we think of this term as one of history, referring to the way things used to happen in the 19th century. But what would a critic of the system back then think of the system we have today? And admittedly, from administration to administration, the giving of jobs to friends or allies or donors, all three of which are different, but still a type of spoil. Picking somebody not because you think they're the most qualified person for the job. What would they think of this? Would they say, "Oh, things have gotten a lot better. Oh, same story, different day"?
I don't think I'd say same story, different day. And I would say that they would believe it did improve, because one of the big stories next week is going to be the emergence of the Progressive Party. And the progressives are reformers. And one of their big reforms that they will have passed, much to the chagrin of the political machine, which I mentioned, is the Civil Service exam, the Civil Service Act. So now all of a sudden, if you want to have certain jobs, you have to take an exam and qualify. So it doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you have to pass an exam, and then how you score on that exam enables you to be placed in whatever positions. So all that's left after that is the cronies are who the presidents, both sides, can appoint to run those executive agencies. And obviously, take a look at the post office and the appointment of our current person in that position. They can have a dramatic impact on the civil service employees by the policies that they will pursue. And those are executive appointments. So there still is a spoil system, but it's much more scaled down, and is absolutely better than it was, from Jackson through the 1880s.
Do you think so? By severely curtailing the number of jobs available to put a crony in, was the response of presidents to say, okay, well, Well, so for the remaining jobs where you could install a crony, are they installing the same percentage of cronies? Are they trying to pack more cronies into fewer available jobs?
No.
Does it change the culture?
There's very few jobs available. And
Right.
so you're talking about executives, heads at the department level or at the very top of each executive agency.
Cabinets.
And ambassadorships and
Absolutely, those remain where they are, and of course, some very good qualified people get there, and some not so qualified. Both parties have appointed some pretty miserable people.
thank you.
Yep. Mr. Krickenberger, did I leave anything out about Civil War politics that you think needs to be brought out, or?
Within an hour, I think you did great.
Well, yeah. Yeah, this is an overview, gang.
Yeah, the one gentleman who asked about Native American involvement.
I wouldn't call him a gentleman, but go ahead.
Thanks again.
Look up Chief Stan Waddy, who was one of the principal chiefs of the Cherokee Nation. He liked the United States as much as Jefferson Davis did. He is actually made a brigadier general, Confederate forces, and leads a lot of Native Americans against the United States out in the West.
Can you spell that name?
Well, his name was S-T-A-N-D, as in David,
Yeah.
W-A-T-I-E. He has like 3 names, but Stan Waddy is probably the most synonymous that everyone knows about. A lot of Civil War historians say the Civil War was primarily lost in the West, where we all assume in the East, Trans-Mississippi area. I mean, Western expansion is still going on. I don't want to steal any of Kendall's thunder on that because he knows a lot more than I do, but you look up like the Mormon involvement as well during the war. A lot of Confederate soldiers that take the oath of allegiance to join the Union Army are moved out west also. And you have all these factions that are all involved with each other west of the Mississippi. So, but there was a lot of Native American involvement out into the western regions.
Thank you.
Good points, Bob. Thank you. Speaking of Mormons, living here in Utah, I'm not a Mormon, not that that matters. Right here in the St. George area where I live, southwestern corner, what's its nickname? Dixie. Because when the Civil War breaks out, the Mormon traders here lose connection with the cotton trade. So what do they try to do? They try to grow cotton in the southwest desert corner of Utah. And of course, as you can imagine, it doesn't go too well, but it sticks. This area was a hotbed of secessionists who were Mormons, and they have maintained that fight. And right today, well, not this day specific, but of course, the fight goes on right now to rename Dixie State University, which is here in St. George, by something new. And you can imagine the politics of that.
Also, you were talking about the expansion of the railroads. You also have the expansion of the telegraph, because President Lincoln actually sends a message to Brigham Young to show that the line is open and all the way, into Utah. And of course, there's a lot of involvement to interrupt that line, of course, as well as with the railroads expanding. So, as I say, there's a lot going on west of the Mississippi at this time.
Absolutely. Good point.
That's your thing. That's your thing, though.
Yeah,
West.
he doth protest too much. He knows a lot. Anybody else? We have time for one more question.
Kendall, I'm curious about the name Whig, and I don't know. I need to do some more reading about it for the meaning in this country. But I recall sort of from long ago that the Whigs in England back in the 1830s were a very progressive party. They were in the forefront of all sorts of terrific reform legislation. expanding the franchise, and child labor laws, and all sorts of forward-looking legislation. Where does the name come from?
Well, your English heritage serves you well, because that's exactly where it comes from. With the breakup of the Federalist Party and the emergence of the Jacksonian Democrats, the Federalists don't know where to go. And many of the old traditional Federalists are literally dying out. And so the new crop of young Federalists who don't like the old Federalist policies are taking on, they're not reformers, but they are looking to modernize, was the term I used in the slide, update things and policies. And they're the first to really argue that federal funds should be used for promoting transportation, canals at the time, railroads later, the telegraph, and other such things. And this becomes a huge debate within Congress before they're shooting at each other, whether or not you should take federal funds for internal improvements. And of course, to this day, we're still fighting over to what degree. I mean, everyone agrees you take federal money and spend it on things, but the argument is to what degree. So the Whigs are going to be the forerunners of the Republican Party. The problem is that half the Whigs won't support abolition and the other half do. So because they waffle the issue of slavery, they just disappear. And in its place comes the Republican Party. So the Republican Party inherits the Whigs, and the Whigs are not to the degree of the British Whigs, but they are reformers of sorts and modernizers, I think is a better word for them. So your thinking was spot on.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful.
You're quite welcome. Time is up. I appreciate you joining. Thanks for coming. We have one more history session before session 5 comes, and we open it up, and you're going to have to start practicing, people, because session 5 is on you guys. I expect class participation. So start thinking about that and coming up with questions that look at history and the parallels to today. So without further ado, good evening. See you next week, I hope.